The HOA elite thought their gated luxury fortress was untouchable. They launched a ruthless legal war to seize my newly purchased land, assuming their wealth gave them absolute control over the valley. But when their lawyers came to threaten me, they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They never checked the historical property lines. They had no idea that the massive steel bridge connecting their multi-million-dollar community to the outside world wasn't public infrastructure. It sat entirely on my dirt. And after the hell they put me through, I was about to close the gates. What happens when an arrogant neighborhood board tries to force you out, only to realize you own the ground beneath their tires? 15 hand-hewn cedar cabins nestled along a quiet, pristine shoreline known as Blackwood Cove. That was my entire world. My grandfather had built them one by one in the 1960s, cutting the timber himself, clearing the brush, and creating a rustic, lakeside haven long before the surrounding valley became a hotspot for developers. To me, these cabins weren't just a business. They were a living piece of family history. I spent my days maintaining the property, repairing the wooden docks, painting the porches, and managing the quiet weekend rentals for families looking to escape the city. It was a peaceful, deeply satisfying routine. My 3 daily meals were taken on the porch of Cabin 1, watching the morning mist rise off the water or the fireflies dance in the evening twilight. I minded my own business, kept the property pristine, and assumed that the massive chunk of land my grandfather had secured decades ago would remain an undisputed sanctuary forever. But true isolation doesn't last when major money moves into the neighborhood. 6 years ago, a massive luxury real estate corporation bought up the remaining hundreds of acres on the higher ridge directly behind my cove. They blasted away the old mountain trails, cleared the ancient trees, and constructed the Peninsula Club, a hyper-exclusive, gated resort community filled with sprawling, multi-million-dollar modern mansions, a private yacht marina, and an immaculate golf course. Within a year, my quiet, historic cove was completely enveloped on 3 sides by a massive fortress of glass, steel, and manicured lawns. The residents of the Peninsula Club looked down from their high cliffs at my rustic, vintage cabins with an undisguised sense of superiority. To them, my grandfather's historic craftsmanship was just an outdated eyesore, a rustic anomaly that disrupted the seamless, ultra-modern luxury aesthetic of their grand master plan. The face of that entitlement belonged to a man named Richard. He was the president of the Peninsula Club's Homeowners Association, a retired corporate executive who treated the neighborhood like his personal corporate fiefdom. Richard was a man obsessed with uniformity, property values, and control. He was famous for patrolling the gated community in his electric golf cart, measuring the height of grass with a ruler, and issuing massive fines for the slightest aesthetic infractions. Because my 15 cabins sat on an independent parcel outside their gated community, I originally assumed I was completely immune to Richard's bureaucratic tyranny. I watched their internal neighborhood drama from a safe distance, entirely content to let them fight over paint swatches and trash can placement. But as the local real estate market boomed, Richard's gaze shifted downward toward the water. The Peninsula Club had a massive problem. Their exclusive mansions sat high on the rocky bluffs, giving them an incredible view but very limited, steep access to the actual lakefront. My 15 cabins, however, occupied the flat, pristine, sand-shored premium beach layout of the cove. The subtle warning signs began appearing at the edge of my property. I would catch Richard standing at the boundary line, holding a digital tablet, pointing aggressively at my docks, and conferring with the HOA's legal team. Then came the letters. At first, they were glossy, corporate-styled offers from the HOA management company, inviting me to harmonize my property with their resort layout. They offered to buy the cove for a fraction of its true value, hinting that my rustic rentals were a visual inconsistency, affecting the overall prestige of the peninsula. I ignored the offers entirely, confident in the absolute security of my grandfather's deed. I thought that as long as I kept to my side of the line, they couldn't touch me. I had vastly underestimated the absolute arrogance of an HOA board that believes its wealth can override the physical boundaries of the earth. Richard didn't just want a compromise. He wanted the cove. And he had just discovered a hidden clause in the county zoning codes that he believed gave HOA the legal power to completely annex my land, seize my cabins, and force me out of my own home forever. The formal assault didn't arrive with a bulldozer or a construction crew. It arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon in the form of a certified, wax-sealed manila envelope left on the porch of Cabin 1. I had just sat down for my afternoon meal, a simple plate of rice and traditional chapati, when I saw the courier walking back down the gravel path. Inside the envelope was a 40-page legal brief stamped with the official insignia of the County Zoning Board and signed by the entire executive panel of the Peninsula Club Homeowners Association. It wasn't an offer to buy the cove anymore. It was a formal notice of intended structural condemnation and public nuisance annexation. Richard had managed to exploit a series of incredibly obscure, heavily updated county ordinances regarding lakeside environmental runoff and uniform shoreline preservation. The document coldly argued that my grandfather's rustic cedar cabins, with their vintage wooden docks and natural sand shorelines, were actively degrading the water quality of the lake and causing severe aesthetic depreciation to the surrounding multi-million-dollar developments. The HOA's legal team had used their massive wealth to commission private, biased environmental studies, claiming my septic systems were a theoretical threat to the valley's watershed. Based on these paid-for fabrications, the HOA was petitioning the county to legally condemn my rental business, strip away my commercial operating license, and force a mandatory sale of the land directly to the resort enclave under the guise of community revitalization. I stood on the porch, the paper shaking slightly in my hand, as a profound wave of disbelief turned into a cold, hard knot of anger in my chest. They weren't just trying to outcompete me. They were trying to erase my family's history with a stroke of a bureaucratic pen. They assumed that an independent local business owner would look at a 40-page wall of corporate legal text and immediately panic, realizing they couldn't afford the legal fees to fight back. I refused to be erased. I threw the legal brief onto my desk, determined to fight them in the trenches of the county courthouse. But Richard was already moving his forces onto the physical ground. When the formal legal threat didn't immediately send me packing, the HOA board shifted their strategy from weaponized paperwork to active, aggressive harassment on the property lines. They realized that a court battle could take months, so they decided to destroy my business in the short term, choking off my income until I could no longer afford to pay my property taxes or my defense attorneys. The targets of their campaign weren't just me. They went after my guests. On a Friday afternoon, as 3 families arrived from the city for their long-awaited weekend rentals at the cabins, they were met at the entrance of the valley by a fleet of private HOA security golf carts and armored black SUVs. Richard's hired security guards, dressed in tactical uniforms, blocked the narrow asphalt access road that led down into the cove. They set up a temporary checkpoint, demanding that my guests produce state identification, vehicle registration, and resort access permits before they would allow them to pass. When my guests explained they were renting the cedar cabins, the security guards deliberately intimidated them. They falsely claimed the cabins were under an active county health investigation, warned them that their vehicles would be subject to immediate towing, and handed them glossy brochures for the Peninsula Club's own luxury rental villas. By the time I realized what was happening and ran up the gravel path to confront the guards, 2 of the families had already turned their cars around in tears, driving back to the highway. My phone began vibrating uncontrollably with cancellation notifications and demands for refunds. In a single weekend, my occupancy dropped by 80%. Richard was successfully starving me out, and the season had barely begun. The financial hit was devastating, but the psychological warfare was designed to break my spirit entirely. When the checkpoint strategy caused a local stir, Richard adapted, replacing the physical blockades with a relentless barrage of petty, fabricated municipal complaints. The Peninsula Club operated on a level of limitless budget that allowed them to essentially command the attention of local code enforcement officers. Every single morning, a different county vehicle would crawl down into the cove. On Monday, it was the fire marshal, summoned by an anonymous complaint claiming my historic wood-burning stoves were a catastrophic wildfire risk to the mansion ridge above. On Wednesday, it was an air quality inspector, citing me for unauthorized particulate emissions because a family was roasting marshmallows over a small, stone-lined campfire on the beach. On Friday, a wildlife official arrived to inspect my wooden docks, claiming the treated lumber from the 1970s was actively poisoning the local turtle population. I spent every waking hour running from cabin to cabin, defending my property against a revolving door of inspectors, displaying historic permits, and filing emergency appeals. I couldn't focus on maintenance. The quiet, peaceful mornings eating my meals on the porch were replaced by a state of exhausting, suffocating anxiety. Every time a car engine rumbled in the distance, my stomach would drop, waiting for the next fine, the next citation, the next threat. The unfairness of it was sickening. The mega mansions on the ridge were constantly running heavy diesel landscaping equipment, blasting the cliffs for new swimming pools, and dumping chemical fertilizers directly onto their manicured golf greens that ran right to the water's edge. Yet, because of their wealth, they were invisible to the county. I was being scrutinized under a microscope for the crime of owning land they wanted. I felt completely isolated, watching my bank account drain as the county bureaucracy slowly sided with the billionaires. But a man protecting his legacy doesn't break. He digs in. By the third week of the siege, with my rental revenue completely ruined and a stack of pending county hearings threatening to shut the cabins down by the end of the month, I reached my breaking point. I realized that playing defense was a losing strategy. I didn't have the money to outlast their lawyers, and I didn't have the political connections to buy off the county inspectors. To survive, I had to stop looking at their fake rules and start looking at the absolute, unalterable truth of the land itself. I locked the doors of Cabin 1, pulled down the shades, and transformed my dining table into a war room. I dragged out 3 heavy, dust-covered leather trunks that had sat in the crawl space since my grandfather passed away. Inside were his original journals, hand-drawn property surveys, blueprint schematics, and every single land deed transaction dating back to when the valley was nothing but dirt and timber tracks. I fell back on the specific, rigorous training of my past career in remote sensing and geographic data engineering. I logged into the state's digital land registry database, pulling decades of raw, unedited property deed extractions, historical plat maps, and spatial coordinate grids of the entire peninsula. For 4 days and nights, I didn't leave the cabin. I lived on coffee and quick snacks, ignoring the buzzing drones that Richard's security team was now flying over my roof. I meticulously cleaned the historical property data, cross-referencing my grandfather's original coordinate survey pins with modern, sub-meter satellite imagery and the official master deeds filed by the luxury developers of the Peninsula Club. I built a comprehensive, layered spatial model of the entire ridge. I traced the lineage of every square inch of land the developers had purchased, tracking how they had carved the mountain into multi-million-dollar luxury parcels. And on the 4th night, as the ambient light of the laptop screen cast long shadows across the cedar walls, my mouse cursor hovered over a specific, narrow strip of land that connected the main county highway to the gated entrance of the resort. I froze. I blinked hard, assuming the exhaustion was causing me to misread the digital coordinates. I ran the data preparation script again, pulling the raw property description directly from the county's original 1962 master deed volume. The data was immaculate. The boundary lines locked into place with absolute, undeniable geometric certainty. 30 years ago, when the luxury developers built the Peninsula Club, they had constructed a grand, brick-paved, 2-lane access road that snaked through the lower valley, crossed the ridge, and passed through their massive iron security gates. This road was the literal lifeblood of their community. It was the only physical path that connected their multimillion-dollar mansions, their yacht marina, and their golf course to the outside world. Without that road, their elite mountain fortress was completely landlocked, separated from civilization by sheer cliffs and impassable ravines. The developers had assumed that the narrow strip of land the road was built upon was a public county right-of-way grandfathered in by an old logging trail. But they had made a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar oversight. According to the original 1961 land patent filed by my grandfather, that exact logging trail had been a private easement granted exclusively to him for timber hauling. When he bought the entire cove, he didn't just buy the beach. He purchased the absolute fee-simple deed to the entire narrow valley corridor stretching all the way to the state highway. He had never dedicated the road to the county. He had never signed an easement agreement with the resort developers. The Peninsula Club's grand, brick-paved entrance road, the ground beneath their luxury SUVs, their security checkpoints, and their private gates, sat entirely, completely and illegally on my private dirt. A slow, visceral smile spread across my face in the dark cabin, the crushing weight of the past month instantly evaporating into a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph. Richard and his HOA board had spent weeks trying to use weaponized rules to steal my cabins, entirely blind to the reality that they didn't even own the ground they used to drive home. I shut my laptop, walked out onto the porch, and looked up at the glittering lights of the mansions on the ridge. The private security golf carts were still patrolling their gates, entirely unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. Richard thought he had checkmated a local cabin owner. He had no idea that I was about to walk up to his multi-million-dollar kingdom and completely pull the rug out from under his entire empire. The digital coordinates glowing on my laptop screen were an absolute, unyielding death sentence for the Peninsula Club. But a digital map alone wasn't enough to stop a multi-million-dollar corporate machine. I needed the kind of undeniable physical proof that would make a county judge tremble and a billionaire sweat. Before the sun even cleared the mountain ridges the following morning, I liquidated a significant portion of my remaining business savings and hired the most respected, ironclad state-certified land surveying crew in the region. I didn't want a standard residential boundary check. I wanted a federal-grade, forensic excavation of the earth. We caught the HOA entirely off guard. At 6 a.m. on a Sunday, while the wealthy residents on the ridge were still asleep inside their luxury estates, the surveying team was already on the asphalt. They shot laser points, calibrated advanced GPS telemetry, and dug through decades of overgrowth to uncover the original, deeply buried 1961 iron property pins driven into the bedrock by my grandfather. By noon, the lead surveyor didn't just confirm my data. He shook his head in absolute, stunned disbelief. The Peninsula Club's grand, brick-paved entrance road, their decorative landscaped medians, and the entire physical approach to their secure iron gates sat exactly 24 feet inside my legal property line. The surveyor stamped the master plat map with a heavy crimson state seal, handed me the legally binding boundary certification, and looked up at the mountain ridge, quietly noting that I now held a multi-million-dollar empire completely by the throat. I possessed the legal weapon to dismantle their entire kingdom. Now it was time to deploy it. I didn't wait for Monday morning to file a slow-moving lawsuit. The HOA had spent weeks using weaponized municipal inspections to paralyze my life, so I decided to enforce my absolute property rights with the exact same unyielding, brutal finality. I drove straight to a commercial equipment rental yard 2 towns over and rented a heavy-duty industrial flatbed truck. By Sunday evening, a convoy arrived at the base of the ridge. I didn't put up a flimsy wooden fence or leave a polite warning note for the board. I dropped 3 massive, 2-ton solid concrete highway barricades directly across the brick-paved lanes, precisely aligning them with the thick, neon orange boundary paint left by the surveyors. Behind the concrete blocks, I constructed a heavy-duty, commercial-grade steel chain-link security gate, binding it to the barriers with thick industrial chains and heavy master padlocks. Right in the dead center of the concrete barricade, facing up the mountain, I bolted a massive, custom-stamped steel sign, "Private property, closed to resort traffic. All unauthorized vehicles will be impounded at owner's expense." I set up a small wooden folding chair directly behind my new iron curtain, poured a fresh thermos of hot tea, and sat down in the quiet mountain air, waiting for the sun to rise on the kingdom above me. They thought they owned the mountain. They were about to realize they couldn't even leave it. Monday morning at 7:30 a.m. was the exact moment the trap snapped shut. This was the peak rush hour when the elite executives, high-priced corporate lawyers, and prominent surgeons of the Peninsula Club climbed into their imported sports cars and luxury SUVs to drive down the ridge to the city. The first vehicle, a sleek, white Porsche sedan, came rounding the final curve of the mountain, accelerating toward the valley, only for the driver's brakes to violently lock up. The tires shrieked against the brick pavers, sending a massive cloud of blue smoke into the air as the car skidded to a halt inches from my concrete wall. The driver sat frozen in absolute, paralyzed shock, staring through his windshield at the massive, private property sign. Within 15 minutes, the single-lane mountain corridor transformed into a chaotic, multi-million-dollar parking lot. Dozens of luxury vehicles, high-end town cars, and heavy delivery trucks were backed up all the way across the ridge, their engines idling helplessly, their horns beginning to blare in a desperate, synchronized chorus of panicked rage. Wealthy residents stepped out of their vehicles in their tailored corporate suits, pointing aggressively at the concrete barriers, their faces twisted in absolute, unhinged confusion. The gridlock was total. And then, the dictator of the peninsula arrived to face the music. The crowd of furious residents parted as Richard's electric HOA security golf cart came flying down the median, accompanied by two black security SUVs with flashing amber lights. Richard jumped out of the cart before it even came to a complete stop, his face a terrifying shade of deep, purple rage, his signature silver clipboard shaking violently in his hand. He marched straight up to the chain-link barrier, his body language radiating the supreme, unbound entitlement of a man who believed his corporate status made him a god in this valley. He slammed his clipboard against the steel frame of my gate, gesturing wildly toward the line of trapped luxury cars, demanding I open the road immediately. His private security guards stepped forward, their hands resting menacingly on their utility belts, attempting to physically intimidate me into backing down. Richard was screaming so hard the veins in his neck were pulsing visibly against his pastel collar. He pulled out his phone, frantically dialing the county authorities, demanding a SWAT team, a demolition crew, and an immediate warrant for my arrest. He thought this was a simple act of criminal extortion, utterly convinced that his political connections would easily sweep a local cabin owner off the map within minutes. I didn't move from my chair. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, watching the absolute collapse of his sanity with a sense of cold, detached vindication. He believed the law belonged to him. He was about to watch it completely turn its back on him. The dramatic climax arrived 20 minutes later with the high-pitched, echoing wail of sirens bouncing off the mountain cliffs. Two county sheriff cruisers came tearing down the highway, sliding to a halt on the public side of my barricades. This was the exact same law enforcement department that had ignored my pleas for help just weeks prior, the same department heavily insulated by the resort's massive tax base. Richard let out a triumphant, predatory smirk, running toward the deputies as they stepped out of their vehicles, pointing his finger directly at my chest, demanding they drag me away in chains for domestic terrorism and blocking a public artery. The lead deputy walked up to the concrete wall, his expression stern, authoritative, and cold. I finally stood up from my chair. I didn't yell and I didn't argue. I simply walked over to the chain-link fence and slid the thick, leather-bound binder containing the stamped master survey and the original 1961 land patent through the steel gaps, handing it directly to the officer. I watched the deputy's face as he flipped open the first page. The authoritative, stern expression instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He walked over to the neon orange paint line, kicked the original rusted iron survey pin protruding from the bedrock, and cross-referenced the coordinates on the certified plat map. The deputy slowly closed the folder, turned around, and looked directly at Richard. The shift in power was instantaneous, absolute, and total. The deputy bluntly informed the HOA president that the road was not public infrastructure, that the county had absolutely no legal jurisdiction to force me to open my own gates, and that the entire multimillion-dollar resort community was currently committing a massive, ongoing criminal trespass on my private land. Richard's jaw dropped so low his clipboard slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the brick pavers. The surrounding crowd of wealthy residents, who had been cheering for my immediate arrest, suddenly went dead silent. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Their elite, multimillion-dollar estates were completely landlocked. Their property values were in free fall, and the entire future of their community was now completely dependent on the mercy of the cabin owner they had tried to ruin. Richard stood there, exposed, humiliated, and utterly powerless in front of his entire constituency. His face completely drained of color as the iron curtain of his own making snapped shut around his neck. I leaned over the concrete barrier, looking directly into the wide, terrified eyes of the man who had tried to steal my legacy, and I delivered the final, devastating reality without saying a word, because the signed legal notice pinned to my gate made it clear that as of right now, the bridge to their paradise was officially closed. The silence that settled over the valley road was heavier than the concrete barricades blocking the asphalt. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the low, rhythmic idle of dozens of trapped luxury engines and the distant rush of the lake water against the shore of the cove. Richard stood completely frozen on the brick pavers, his hands trembling so violently that the papers on his silver clipboard rattled like dry leaves. He looked down at the thick, neon-orange line running beneath his expensive Italian leather loafers, then up at the massive concrete blocks, and finally at the county sheriff's deputies who were casually leaning against their cruisers. The immediate aftermath of the blockade was a masterclass in chaotic, upper-class panic. The wealthy residents of the Peninsula Club, realizing that the law enforcement officers they had essentially funded through the county tax base were completely powerless to help them, began to lose their collective minds. These were people who were used to snapping their fingers and having reality bend to their desires. Now they were physically landlocked. Their million-dollar modern estates, their private yacht marina, and their pristine golf course were entirely cut off from the rest of civilization by a single unyielding line of private dirt. As the morning sun climbed higher, baking the asphalt, the reality of their isolation turned into a desperate, sweating retreat. One by one, prominent corporate executives, high-priced lawyers, and elite surgeons were forced to turn off their ignition keys. They stepped out of their pristine luxury SUVs and sports cars, grabbed their leather briefcases and designer gym bags, and began the long, humiliating, miles-long walk back up the steep mountain ridge on foot. The grand approach to the exclusive gated community looked like a pedestrian evacuation route. Richard was left standing alone at the barricades, his authority entirely stripped away in front of the very homeowners he had promised to protect. The legal meltdown. By Tuesday morning, the economic siege of the peninsula had triggered a full-blown emergency. Because the brick-paved access road was the only physical entry point into the development, the entire community ground to a catastrophic halt. Delivery trucks carrying gourmet groceries were turned away at my gate. Private landscaping crews, pool maintenance contractors, and domestic staff were locked out. Trash containers began to overflow in the summer heat, and construction on 3 massive new megamansions was instantly frozen. The HOA's high-priced corporate legal machine spent 48 hours frantically filing emergency injunctions, attempting to find a sympathetic judge who would order the immediate removal of my concrete barriers. But my data development and remote sensing reports were architecturally flawless. My attorney met them in the judge's chambers with the unedited 1961 fee simple deed extraction, the original land patents, and the newly certified forensic survey stamps. The law of the land was absolute. The developers had committed a multimillion-dollar oversight by failing to secure a public right-of-way or a recorded easement over my grandfather's private logging corridor. No judge in the state was going to risk municipal or state-level liability by authorizing a court-sanctioned trespass on privately held land to rescue a private resort corporation. Every single one of the HOA's emergency motions was systematically, brutally swatted down. They had zero legal leverage, zero alternative routes, and their billionaire clients up the mountain were on the verge of an absolute mutiny. On Thursday afternoon, the high-priced corporate law firm representing the Peninsula Club formally begged for a meeting. We didn't gather in a courtroom. We met in a neutral, sterile conference room downtown. Richard sat across the massive oak table, flanked by 3 senior real estate litigators who looked thoroughly defeated. The arrogant, untouchable corporate executive who had spent months terrorizing my rental business with weaponized code inspections was completely unrecognizable. His face was a hollow, exhausted pale, his pastel shirt was wrinkled, and he couldn't even look me in the eye. I didn't bring a legal team. I walked in alone, slid a single, neatly typed page of demands across the polished wood, and sat back in my chair. The terms of surrender. The contract I presented was an absolute, uncompromising declaration of total capitulation. I wasn't interested in a one-time financial settlement. A lump sum of cash is eventually spent and forgotten. I wanted a permanent, generational shield that would protect Blackwood Cove for the next century, ensuring that no developer could ever threaten my family's legacy again. A first. The Peninsula Club Homeowners Association was required to immediately and permanently withdraw all municipal complaints, environmental petitions, and structural condemnation filings against my 15 cabins. They were forced to cover all of my accumulated legal fees and submit a formal, signed retraction to the county zoning board, admitting that their environmental runoff studies were entirely fabricated. A second, the private HOA security force was completely disbanded from operating anywhere near the valley floor. The security checkpoints were permanently prohibited, and the guards were banned from interacting with, filming, or documenting my rental guests. A third, the absolute core of the agreement was a mandatory 99-year commercial land lease for the narrow valley corridor beneath their entrance road. If they wanted to drive a single tire across my dirt to reach their mansions, the HOA would have to pay an astronomical, non-negotiable monthly access fee. I set the rate at a premium commercial figure, indexed to inflation, with a strict clause stating that a single missed or late payment would automatically authorize me to drop the concrete barriers back across the road without notice. A fourth, the HOA was required to pay a massive, immediate retroactive trespassing penalty to cover the 3 decades their brick-paved road had illegally occupied my property. The lead defense attorney visibly choked when he read the financial figures. Richard slammed his hands on the table, his voice cracking as he shouted that the terms would completely bankrupt the community's treasury, forcing them to levy catastrophic, 5-figure special assessment fees on every single homeowner on the ridge. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I simply checked my watch, stood up, and told them that if they didn't like the financial terms of the lease, they were more than welcome to hire a demolition crew to completely scrape their brick road off my property by sunset. The realization that they had absolutely no alternative broke them completely. With a shaking hand and a heavy gold pen, Richard signed the master lease agreement, legally binding his entire luxury empire to the financial mercy of the cabin owner he had tried to destroy. The fall of the Peninsula dictator. The internal collapse of the Peninsula Club was spectacular, rapid, and entirely self-inflicted. When the wealthy residents received the emergency corporate notices detailing the massive, mandatory special assessments required to pay my retroactive trespassing penalty and fund the new, exorbitant monthly bridge lease, the gated community turned into a vicious, cannibalistic war zone. The homeowners, furious at the realization that their luxury investments were permanently financially burdened due to the gross negligence of their own leadership, turned their absolute rage onto Richard and the executive board. A massive, multimillion-dollar internal class action lawsuit was filed by the residents against the board members personally. Richard's supreme corporate authority evaporated overnight. He was universally ousted from the presidency in a chaotic, screaming emergency meeting where his neighbors openly branded him a liability and a failure. The social isolation was total. The man who used to patrol the cul-de-sacs in his golf cart like a military dictator became an absolute pariah. His luxury electric cart was found pushed into a water hazard on the golf course, and people openly turned their backs when he walked down the street. Unable to handle the profound public humiliation and facing crippling personal legal fees from his own community's lawsuits, Richard was forced to put his sprawling cliffront mansion on the market. But the real estate market had quickly caught wind of the catastrophic land lease hanging over the peninsula. The community was no longer seen as an elite sanctuary. It was viewed as a financial trap. Property values plummeted across the ridge. Richard's estate sat entirely frozen on the market for months before he was finally forced to liquidate it to an investment firm at a devastating 60% financial loss. Watching the heavy commercial moving trucks haul his designer furniture away past my cabins, rolling over the very brick road he had signed away, was a moment of deep, quiet vindication. The rebirth of Blackwood Cove. Down along the quiet shoreline of Blackwood Cove, the natural balance of life quickly healed. With the HOA's legal harassment entirely dismantled and the security checkpoints pulled off the valley floor, my weekend rental business experienced an unprecedented boom. Families from the city flocked back to the 15 hand-hewn cedar cabins, drawn by the historic, rustic charm and the absolute peace of the sand shoreline. The vintage wooden docks were filled with canoes, the sound of children laughing echoed across the water, and the small, stone-lined campfires burned brightly beneath the evening sky. Every single month, like absolute clockwork, a heavily certified, high-value commercial check arrives in my mailbox from the Peninsula Club's corporate treasury. I don't use the revenue to buy luxury imports or tailored suits. I pour every single dollar back into the earth. I have systematically purchased the remaining undeveloped forest tracts surrounding the valley, creating a massive, permanent conservation buffer zone that completely blocks any future corporate expansion. The 15 cabins my grandfather built with his own 2 hands are now protected by an ironclad, multi-million-dollar financial fortress of their own making. Sometimes, in the quiet twilight, I sit on the heavy cedar porch of Cabin 1, enjoying my evening meal of traditional wheat chapati and hot tea. I look up at the towering rocky ridges on the far side of the water, watching the distant headlights of luxury SUVs crawl slowly down the mountain, passing through the valley corridor. The residents of the peninsula still have their beautiful, floor-to-ceiling glass views of the lake. But every single time their tires hit those brick pavers, they are reminded of exactly who owns the ground beneath them. They believed that their wealth and corporate status granted them absolute dominion over the valley, assuming that a quiet, independent property owner could be easily crushed by weaponized rules and endless legal funding. They learned the hard way that true ownership isn't dictated by a title on an HOA board or the size of a bank account. It is defined by the absolute boundary lines drawn in the earth and the uncompromising willingness to defend your legacy to the very end. If an arrogant group of wealthy neighbors launched a war to steal your family's history, how much would you charge them just to drive home every day?